Hello and welcome to this Unit 1 overview for Metro 101. We begin Unit 1 by introducing the Chen book and looking at his first 4 chapters. We then shift gears and look at Clay's first 4 chapters. So Chen starts pretty basic. Why are cities important? And he tells us that over half of the world lives in cities. So when we look at the global population, that is between 7.5 and 8 billion people today, over half of them live in metropolitan areas. So when we look at metropolitan studies, we're looking at studying the lives of over 3.5 billion people around the world. Not just American cities, not just your local communities, but 3.5 billion plus people around the world. We're looking at engines for economic growth. Well, in the United States, we're looking at over 95% of our economic activity is taking place in metropolitan areas. Around the world, we're seeing an increasing level of economic activity happening in our developing countries. So we're looking at half of the world's population, and we're looking at really the economic might and development and opportunities. And in Chapter 1, Chen really does a nice job of introducing this idea of metropolitan areas are the homes to human experiences. This sense of place, this idea that where we live builds our identity, our community, our sense of security. And he really goes into some nice examples of how cities, neighborhoods, metro areas are a big part of who we are, and how individual parks and pubs and libraries and cafes, the locations he calls third places, allow us to build our communities, our sense of security, our identity. So the human experiences, the sense of place that Chen lays out in Chapter 1 really carries throughout the book, throughout his readings, throughout his chapters, as he has a way of connecting not only what we could quantify with stats, not only what we could talk about with news stories, but what is it like to live in these different cities, in these communities, in these metro areas, and in these places today and in the past. In Chapter 2, Chen introduces some early theorists. Now, in 2020, we have the benefit of hindsight. We know based on recordings, we know based on written history, documented events, what happened and what these places were like. Our early theorists, beginning in the 19th century or the 1800s, were discovering this new form of urban life. Now, cities have been around for about 6,000 years in some form or another, but it really wasn't until the second half of the 1700s into the 1800s that cities as we know them began to evolve. So our early theorists were interested in understanding the human condition in these cities. How were these cities different than the living conditions, the family units, the friend units that we were accustomed to? A couple of our early theorists, Simmel and Tönnies, began to compare Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, the idea of community versus society, that our traditional ways of interacting, the strong community, Gemeinschaft, was different than what they were seeing in our cities. Our cities were places where interactions were very sterile, very transactional. We had a clerk and a customer, not really like a family unit or a tight bond. So when our early theorists were beginning to explain what this new city life was like, they didn't give it the best image. We also saw how individuals like Frederick Engels and Karl Marx began to apply their writings, their theories during this time, seeing individuals flood into cities and see what they explained as labor exploitation, that the owners of capital, or the business owners, the owners that were driving economic and urban development, were taking advantage of people that were moving to the cities for work. And the Marxist viewpoint really has influenced a range of philosophies in metropolitan studies, even in the 21st century. And one of the more popular theories that came out of this era was the Chicago School concentric zone theory. And there was a handful, or there was really 3 prominent theorists that we'll look at that try to understand social space. And they looked at different neighborhoods, different parts of the cities as zones, and within those zones there was competition for space, and they took very much a biological view of what was happening. They tried to apply hard science to explaining interactions and experiences in cities. So these early theorists, again, they didn't benefit from hindsight. They were trying to be proactive in explaining and supporting what they were finding. They didn't have the advantage of research articles. They didn't have the advantage of peer-reviewed materials and decades of journals and writings and academic literature to support their ideas. What they were doing was trying to explain something relatively new. In Chapter 3, we jump ahead to the post-World War II era. Theorists that began working in the 1940s and 50s through modern theorists in the 21st century. And we see a number of Marx descendants, particularly David Harvey, who worked out of Johns Hopkins University and looked at cities critically through a Marxist perspective and saw that cities were basically composed of a series of exploitation between those that have and those that don't. So we'll look at a couple different Marxist theorists and see how they perceive cities and life in these places. After that, we'll look at a couple of my favorite theorists, Jane Jacobs and Sharon Zukin and Herbert Gans. And these individuals, they took a different approach. They were concerned with better understanding the human experience, better understanding community in our cities. Jacobs worked out of the West Village or Greenwich Village in New York City and tried to create models and theories based on her life and her community. Zukin set the stage for some pretty interesting looks at topics like gentrification and how Americans, for example, change what she calls places of production into places of consumption. You've probably witnessed these places yourself when you go into a gentrifying or a trendy community and you see old warehouses or factories that have been restored into condos, into trendy restaurants, into retail shops. So she's looking at how we transform physical space to meet our current consumption demands. And Herbert Gans looked at the West End of Boston and examined how a strong community existed there, while the city was looking to demolish what they called a blighted area because it was relatively low income. The city was only looking at statistics and saying, this community here is barely living above the poverty line. We should wipe this out and introduce economic development that'll bring investment into the area. Gans went into the area and spent a considerable amount of time conducting what's called an ethnographic study, studying the people that live there, being part of that experience. And he found something quite opposite, that this was a thriving, strong community. While the per capita income might not have been what the city desired, he saw that what was in place was generations of community, and that by demolishing that neighborhood, you're going to shatter a sense of security. So these theorists really bring that human aspect into living in cities. And then in the 1980s, we saw a paradigm shift into our urban theorists looking at globalization and how our cities are no longer just serving a local or regional population, but now they're part of a bigger picture. They're part of a global supply chain, a global division of labor, and that cities like New York and Washington and LA, they sit at the top of American cities in this global hierarchy, where regional cities like Baltimore and Pittsburgh, they fall into a different category of cities. So these theorists bring us through the last 70 years or so, and they really show us the different ways of perceiving and understanding cities. Some of them you may agree with, some of them you might find exciting, some of them you may not agree with based on your personal experiences. But the important thing is that these different theorists have validated their work through different examples. And then we're going to wrap up the Chen readings in Unit 1 by looking at rules for studying metropolitan areas, just in time for you to complete your first field report. And Chen highlights validity and reliability. Validity meaning that whatever you're perceiving, whatever you're documenting, whatever you're stating as true is validated through your experiences and observations and also academic literature. So while our early theorists like the Chicago School didn't have the advantage of all of this documented academic literature, you do. So your comments, your statements of fact need to be validated, and they need to be reliable, meaning that whatever you're expressing isn't just this one moment in time that you captured something you believe. This is something that can be repeated again and again. It could serve as a reliable statement of truth, a statement of fact, a statement of supported opinion. So Chen, in Unit 1, is going to introduce us to cities and bring us through a couple paradigm shifts of theorists. And then we're going to wrap up Unit 1, or we're going to incorporate into Unit 1 Grady Clay's How to Read an American City. And I think this is a fun way to approach cities. The writing is light, it's engaging, it's not weighed down with academic depth. This is really a unique way that Grady Clay, who worked a couple decades ago, was able to convey the way he perceived cities. And he was able to build that reliability because what he found in some cities was found in other cities. So he made these reliable, valid statements by creating simple terms that supported direct observations and applying these observations to multiple cities. So I like his statement that there are no true secrets, only undisclosed evidence waiting for us. So one of the things I always hear after incorporating the Clay book into a class is that students see cities and towns differently after reading Clay. They see that I see breaks all the time. I see identity makers all the time. I see these different concepts in my day-to-day life that I never saw before. So I think Clay, through his simple writing, his direct links to observations, really does allow us to see evidence that we've overlooked in the past. Clay, again, writing decades ago, recognized that we oftentimes rely on television, computers, electronic information, sometimes just garbage, junk that we find on the internet to help us better understand places. While we need to get outside of that, we need to find the evidence on our own. And the field reports in this course are going to allow you to find that undisclosed evidence that's waiting for us. And I think you're going to find this enjoyable. If you engage this material, if you read it, if you're open to learning and you're open to exploring, the Clay readings could really help you see the areas you live in a new light. So these are just some topics that are going to be covered in Unit 1, an overview. The readings and the lecture slides will offer more depth. If you have questions along the way, let me know, and we'll touch base soon.